Just a sec. Okay. Hello, everyone. The topic of my speech today is desegregation busing in the US. I remember I was watching one of the Democratic debates last year when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris got into a rather heated argument about something called busing that happened in the 70s. Kamala Harris was very adamant about Joe Biden's role in this busing, but I had no idea what they were arguing about. The only thing I understood was that when Kamala Harris was a little girl, she had to take a bus to school, and that it was a bad thing and somehow Joe Biden's fault, or that it could be a good thing, but Joe Biden was against it. And then I happened to come across this word again in some other context. And so I decided to look it up and find out what it was. It turned out that busing, or more precisely, desegregation busing, was a measure proposed and adopted with varying degrees of success in the 70s to fight racial segregation in public schools in America. So what does this mean? Children from predominantly African-American neighborhoods would be taken by bus to a school in another area, which was predominantly white. And vice versa, children from predominantly white areas would be taken by bus to a school where most children were African-American. I will get back to the fight between now President Biden and now VP Harris during the debate. But first, let us look at how this measure came about and what the outcomes were, how people responded to it. Well, as we all know, the US is a country built on democracy. And so it is in the spirit of democracy that once slavery was abolished around 1860s, different states, mostly in the South, but some others as well, started adopting so-called Jim Crow laws. The purpose of these laws was to legalize and enforce racial segregation. Now, Jim Crow was not some white senator from Deep South trying to hold on to his past, as may seem from the name of those laws, although this would have been bad enough. Jim Crow actually was a fictional character. It was a folk trickster that was very popular among slaves in America. And then at some point, at certain Thomas D. Rice created a stage persona based on this character. It was essentially a caricature. It was a racist depiction of the original character, Jim Crow, who was popular among the slaves. And that's the origin of the name of these laws. As I said, Jim Crow laws were adopted by different states. There were also some local laws, municipalities and districts. These laws started coming into force after the Civil War. And effectively, these laws mandated racial segregation in all public places, all public facilities, including public transportation, buses and railroad cars, public schools, restaurants, restrooms, and even drinking fountains. So Black and white people could not use the same restaurants or the same restrooms or ride the same train cars. These laws were challenged on several occasions. For example, in 1896, there was a famous case, Plessy versus Ferguson. So the plaintiffs tried to challenge those laws, but the laws were upheld by the US Supreme Court. The Supreme Court cited the separate but equal principle. According to this principle, racial segregation does not infringe on the rights of African Americans and does not violate the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, as long as African Americans are provided the same quality services. So it was argued that although Black Americans have to go to separate schools and ride separate buses, the quality of education and other services provided to them was the same as the one provided to white Americans. But this, of course, was not true. Facilities for African Americans were across the board inferior compared to facilities for white Americans. They were also severely underfunded. They had meager resources. So the services were not equal in quality. And so those laws effectively institutionalized economic, educational, and social disadvantages for African Americans for over 100 years until about 1968. And note, way after the end of the Second World War, in which America fought for freedom and democracy. But even after 1968, those practices were not rolled back overnight. Now, the real struggle started in 1951. In 1951, a Black resident of Topeka, Kansas, tried to enroll his daughter in the local elementary school. Now, the local public school district refused to do so. Instead, they said that the little girl had to take a bus to a segregated all-Black school. Oliver Brown didn't take it, and he challenged this decision in the local court. But the judge ruled that the segregated school was comparable to the local white school in terms of the quality of curriculum, teacher qualifications, and other features. After that, Oliver Brown, together with several other local families, filed a class action lawsuit in the federal court against the local Board of Education. The federal court again ruled against the plaintiffs. Then Brown and others took the case further to the Supreme Court. They claimed that the segregation policy was unconstitutional. This case has become known in history as Brown versus Board of Education. On May 17, 1954, so 3 years later, the Supreme Court issued a unanimous ruling in favor of the Brown family and the other plaintiffs. This decision signaled the end of racial segregation in schools, legally, that is, on paper. However, the road to implementing this decision in practice was slow and painful. Most white people in the South at the time viewed the ruling as a catastrophe. But despite their fierce resistance to change, the Brown case did usher in the end of the Jim Crow laws and the beginning of desegregation efforts as part of the civil rights movement. Now, fast forward to the 70s, enter busing. As I said in the beginning, the idea was to use buses in an attempt to desegregate American public schools. Now, why did they need to transport children by bus? Well, the problem was that segregation at schools was tied in with segregation in neighborhoods. Many neighborhoods across the country were segregated due to various demographic trends, such as emergence of white suburbs. This is when white people were moving to the suburbs of large cities. There were also discriminatory housing practices, which I'm not going to go into in this speech. But the bottom line is, because communities were segregated, public schools in these communities were also segregated. And so to promote diversity, children from a white neighborhood had to be transported to an African American neighborhood and vice versa. So this phenomenon, desegregation busing, became a highly controversial political issue, which had both supporters and opponents. Those who supported busing argued that it was a necessary measure that was needed for school integration, that the practice was essential for correcting the damaging legacy of racial segregation in schools. But its opponents argued that children were transported to unsafe neighborhoods. They also said that children had to go through very long commutes. In 1971, the Supreme Court issued another decision which effectively mandated using busing to desegregate schools. This decision drew sharp criticism from white Americans, not only in the South, but nationwide. Another court decision was issued later in 1974. In this case, a federal judge ordered the city of Boston to desegregate its public schools using busing. And in response to this order, protests erupted in Boston, which at some point turned violent. While white residents pelted school buses carrying African American children with bricks and bottles. Angry mobs attacked schools. These riots got national news coverage. And so this was at the heart of the heated exchange between then Senator Kamala Harris and former Vice President Joe Biden. So in the 70s, over 40 years ago, it turned out that Joe Biden was among those who opposed busing, though his argument was different. He believed that busing made it possible for schools to achieve racial quotas, but without really having to create a level playing field for all students. So 40 years later, Joe Biden came under fire during his election campaign, not only for opposing busing, but also for working with segregationists to fight this measure. In particular, Joe Biden worked with two senators, a senator from Mississippi, James Eastland, and a Georgia senator, Herman Talmadge. Both of the senators opposed civil rights in general and supported segregation. Now, Joe Biden mentioned his work with the two senators, he mentioned it during the election campaign, trying to demonstrate that he can work not only with people in his party, people that he agrees with, but he can also successfully work with people that he has disagreements with. But this political move backfired. Joe Biden was harshly criticized by his Democratic presidential rivals, as the Democratic Party today has become more progressive. And this is the context in which Kamala Harris attacked him. She was one of those students of color, a little girl in the 70s, who rode a bus every day to school as part of the effort towards racial integration of public schools in America. Now, 40 years later, unfortunately, it looks like the fight for equal opportunities in education in the US is far from over. 66 years have passed since the landmark court decision, but racial segregation in public schools is alive and kicking from what I can tell. According to a report from UCLA Civil Rights Project, segregation has negative impact on the achievement, college success, long-term employment, and income of students of color. And from what I can tell, from what I have been reading about the issue for the past few days, this fight is very far from over. And in conclusion, every time I come across a story like that, I can't help thinking to myself, and these people have been lecturing the entire world about democracy. Thank you.